Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Wood, and the title of my presentation is Invading Armies from Yankeeland, U.S.-Cuba Gridiron Clashes in the First Half of the 20th Century. Before I get started, I want to give a bit of a note that this is a smaller piece of a much larger project, so I'm basically going to focus in on one example because of the fact this is a pre-recorded presentation. All right, so in December 1923, the Rollins College varsity football team from Winter Park, Florida, which is close to Orlando, traveled to Havana to play football games against teams from the Cuban National Police, the University of Havana, and Club Atlético de Cuba, or Atletico. The Rollins squad won all three contests convincingly, defeating the Cuban National Police 59-0, the University of Havana 45-0, and Atletico 31-0. After the first game, local newspaper Diario de la Marina referred to Rollins College's team as the, quote, invading armies from Yankeeland, end quote. Other Cuban print coverage of the games used similar language, calling the Floridians the, quote, invading football aggregation, end quote, and the invaders, quote, and within quotes. All right, so press coverage of this series of games provided examples of wider trends of martial descriptions of American football games played between the U.S. and Cuban teams, which were consistent with broader conceptions of American football as a war game. These descriptions also underscored the neo-colonial relationship established by the United States after the War of 1898. Even though there were about 69 total American football games played between U.S. and Cuban teams from 1899 through 1959. Due to time constraints, as I mentioned before, this presentation will focus on one example. The game played between Louisiana State University and the University of Havana on Christmas Day, 1907. So, after the War of 1898, the United States exerted hegemonic military, political, economic, and cultural influence over Cuba. The introduction of American football to the local athletic culture occurred concurrently to the establishment of this neo-colonial relationship. The University of Havana founded a varsity football team in 1905, and here's an image of that first varsity team, their team photograph from 1905 and 1906. In 1906, University of Havana, this varsity team played two games against U.S. military teams. And going into 1907, University of Havana's varsity team invited Louisiana State University's team for a game on Christmas Day, 1907. So during the second occupation of Cuba by the U.S. military, on Christmas Day, 1907, Louisiana State University, LSU's football team easily defeated the University of Havana's varsity squad by a score of 56-0 in front of an estimated crowd of 4,200 spectators at Almendares Park in Havana. Prior to the contest, the New Orleans Daily Picayune anticipated strong support for the Tigers from the estimated 10,000 Americans, including winter tourists in the vicinity of Havana. The late Peter Finney, a longtime New Orleans sports writer and author of several books on Louisiana sport history, framed his account of the game as taking place in the shadow of the War of 1898. He wrote, quote, "The appearance of the first American college team on foreign soil came at a time when the Cuban situation remained touchy in the wake of the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine had not yet died away. U.S. Army garrisons were still stationed at Camp Columbia, and U.S. Navy vessels rode at anchor in the harbor where the hull of the sunken ship was visible above the water, end quote. Finney and other sources noted the presence of U.S. military servicemen and their contribution to the game day atmosphere. Pat Ryan, a player on the 1907 LSU team, recalled, quote, "Every time we made a touchdown, you'd have thought there was a flock of blackbirds flying across the field. Those sailors from the Paducah and the Dubuque would toss their blue hats in the air," end quote. The Reveille, the LSU student newspaper, confirmed the servicemen's conduct, but described their behavior as engaging in the, quote, "good old American custom of rooting," end quote. Memory of the War of 1898 colored Finney's somewhat ahistorical account of U.S. citizens, soldiers, and sailors in attendance at the game, and revealed the intersection of American football with U.S. imperialism in Cuba. So, nearly a century removed from the war, Finney wryly wondered why, given the events of the game and its outcome, it, quote, failed to touch off a second war with Spain, end quote. And this is despite the fact that the U.S. was allied with Cubans during the War of 1898, and frankly, the U.S. intervened in the Cuban War of Independence from Spain in that conflict. So, whether a storytelling device or not by Finney, the absence of Cuban agency from the outset spoke to how the war entered the popular imagination and the perceived power dynamics between the U.S. and Cuba. They were an afterthought or just assumed that they were the Spanish or were the opposing side in that war. From this account, it's kind of a muddled approach to history in particular. All right, so the game drew a large crowd. Finney claimed that 10,000 people were in attendance, but as I mentioned before, contemporary accounts estimated the crowd at 4,200 spectators, and that government and consular officials were in attendance, as well as U.S. soldiers and sailors. Overall, Finney's account related the presence of the U.S. military, not just in Havana, but at the LSU University of Havana game. But he did not call it an occupation. Didn't acknowledge that was the state of the situation at that time. But even if in jest, he acknowledged Cuba's place in the U.S. imperial project when he described the U.S. team's performance on the field and the festivities that followed as, quote, LSU's conquest of Cuba, end quote. A contemporary local source provided an account that was a bit more forthright. In a preview for the Christmas Day game, Cuban newspaper Diario de la Marina expected that the, quote, 2 gunboats in the harbor, end quote, and that, quote, Camp Columbia, end quote, will send groups of servicemen to the game to, quote, root for the Louisiana boys. The account also stated that, quote, all officials of the state, province, city, and military occupation have been invited, end quote, including Governor Charles Magoon. This was going to be not just a sporting event, but also a representation of U.S. presence in Cuba, both in terms of military, political, and then cultural with football. An account of the game from the same newspaper concluded that, quote, an account of the game, so following the game, from Diario de la Marina, concluded that, quote, Louisianans and the Havanese alike hope to fight the war all over again at a future date, with the victory on the other banner next time, end quote. While it remarked on good sportsmanship shown by both teams and used fighting a war metaphorically, given the context of U.S. occupation, presence of U.S. servicemen at the game, and the lopsided nature of the contest, this statement, especially the dream of an opposite outcome, could be interpreted as a subtle critique of U.S.-Cuba relations and power dynamics at the time. These subtle critiques become much more explicit in Fernando Ortiz Fernandez's football essay from his book Entre Cubanos from 1913. Ortiz was an influential Cuban anthropologist who also was a politician. He served a couple of terms in the Cuban House of Representatives, and he commented on the American football game played between the University of Havana and LSU. As I mentioned before, LSU won 56-0, and Ortiz searched for answers as to why the local squad, which he called, quote, cannon fodder, end quote, suffered such an overwhelming defeat. He observed that both sides had the same number of players, and that in a game of strength, the University of Havana may even have had a size advantage relative to the Louisianans. But Ortiz concluded the same weaknesses existing in the newly formed Cuban governments were also apparent on the gridiron. He listed those off as a lack of discipline, a lack of focus, and lack of perseverance. He recognized the potential, flashes of brilliance shown on the gridiron, but there was no sustained performance. So Ortiz concluded that Cubans should, quote, learn from the North American football players, end quote, because the lessons provided by American football, those of preparation, practice, continuous effort, aggressiveness, determination, could be applied to public life. In adopting U.S. football, or adopting this U.S. sport, could benefit the development of Cuban young men and prepare them for future encounters with the United States, both on the gridiron and off the gridiron. So as another point that Ortiz made was, and this was towards the end of his essay, that as long as Cubans did not develop those qualities, those qualities associated with successful American football players, that they could expect to be treated as children by the United States. And so he saw it as sort of an imperative for Cubans to play American football and master the game as a means of building and developing those positive qualities, but also to be able to meet the United States as peers, both within sports and outside of sports. So again, this is one example among many examples, but because of time constraints, I wanted to focus on one. Beyond this game from 1907 and reflections upon it, there's reoccurrences of the language of war, of invasion, of interventions in the context of these games. And again, I wanted to use this as an opportunity or a starting point for this sort of discussion. So thank you for your time, and that is all for this presentation.